So let's pick up where we left off in the Prezi with Kiev, what has often been referred to as the mother of Russian cities. Now, most of you probably know Kiev today as the capital of modern Ukraine, but historically it was the first major city to be established in the land that becomes the Russian Empire, and so it is seen as the foundation city for Russian culture. I thought it would be helpful to start out with a look at a map of modern-day Ukraine. You can see Kiev's location in the northern part of the country on the banks of the Dnieper River, which, along with the Volga, was a major trade route in the 10th and 11th centuries between Europe and the Eastern Roman Empire. You may notice the spelling of Kiev has changed. The current preference is to spell the name Kyiv, reflecting modern Ukrainian language. For this course, we will use the historical spelling Kiev, which calls back to a time before Ukraine and Russia were separate entities. You should also notice some of Ukraine's many neighbors: Russia to the northeast and east, Belarus to the north, and Poland to the northwest, along with Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. While these are separate nations today, at various points in history they have all belonged to the same, or at different times rival, empires. The legacy of these border disputes is still playing out today in eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. Here we have an artist's rendering of ancient Kiev with the Cathedral of St. Sophia in the center. Now, this cathedral is important in the history of Kiev because it represents a direct and deliberate link to the city of Constantinople, the center of Eastern Christianity, formerly known as Byzantium and today known as Istanbul. Constantinople had its own Hagia Sophia, and when this one was built by Yaroslav the Wise, he was looking directly to make that connection. When the Grand Prince of Kiev in the late 10th century, Vladimir the Bright Sun, chose Christianity as the religion for his people, this is the brand he chose. This becomes important in later years. In 1054, an event known as the Great Schism occurs, dividing Eastern and Western Christianity, with each then viewing the other as heretics. Western Christianity develops into Roman Catholicism, and Eastern Christianity develops into Orthodoxy, a term which literally means right praise, or the correct way of worshiping. And we should be clear that Vladimir did impose Christianity on his subjects. They were not allowed freedom of choice in the matter. That leads to a phenomenon in Russian culture known as dvoyeveria, or dual faith, when people profess Christian beliefs outwardly, but at home still practice their pagan beliefs. And this dvoyeveria is the source of many traditional fairy tales in Russian culture and is always an undercurrent to even today's Orthodox beliefs. So who lived in this area around Kiev? Well, the Rus people probably came from the far north, were most likely related to the Scandinavians. As they settled along the Dnieper, they acquire the more general moniker of Slav, which is where we get the term Slavic today to describe the peoples of much of Eastern Europe, like the Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Czechs, Bosnians, Croats, etc. They're all Slavs. There was evidence of some political structure in the area by the mid-9th century, with power centered in the hands of chivalrous princes, dominated by one grand prince. We don't yet use the term Tsar at this point in history. And by chivalrous, we're not talking about politeness and opening doors for ladies and things. Chivalry was essentially a code of honor based on reciprocal obligations. Princes and their subjects at all levels of society all had responsibilities to one another. The princes relied on knights to provide protection and security, and sometimes to wage war, and the term for these knights was bogatyr, a word which appears frequently in poems and songs about ancient Rus. The people of Rus became prosperous traders, and in the 10th and 11th centuries, Kiev was one of the wealthiest cities of Europe and was larger than London or Paris at the time. Now, who were some of the major figures of ancient Kiev? The first celebrity, so to speak, was Vladimir the Bright Sun, whom I've already mentioned a couple of times. His main contribution was the selection of Christianity, even though he essentially forced it on his subjects. Remember to associate this religious choice with the term dvoyeveria, or dual faith. The next major ruler was Yaroslav, one of Vladimir's sons, and a grand prince who acquires the nickname the Wise because he valued education and he led a relatively peaceful period of growth. He developed infrastructure by building hospitals and schools, or the ancient equivalents of such things. He modeled the city on Constantinople, and as I mentioned earlier, he was responsible for the building of the St. Sophia Cathedral. In fact, he began a long tradition in Russia of bringing in foreign artists and architects to craft the look of a city. He believed in education, as I said, and he himself spoke 5 languages, and he had all of his children educated. He also married his children into the other royal families of Europe. His daughter Anna was married to King Henry I of France, and she was literate when Henry I was not. In fact, Queen Elizabeth of England today can trace her ancestry back to Yaroslav through Anna and Henry I. It was also during Yaroslav's reign that the first Russian code of laws was produced, the Pravda Russkaya. This was quite humane by medieval standards, with relatively little corporal or capital punishment and very prescribed punishments for specific offenses. Finally, the last major Grand Prince of Kiev was Vladimir Monomach, one of Yaroslav's grandsons. He too led a relatively peaceful period in Kievan history, but after his death there was a great deal of strife among his sons and others as they struggled for power, and this left Kiev weakened and susceptible to invasion. Vladimir was somewhat cosmopolitan, as his mother was Greek and his wife was English, and his lasting contribution to the treasures of the Kremlin was his sable crown, really more of a cap, which was used in the coronation of every Tsar for about 300 years. You can still see it in the Kremlin Museum today. Take a moment to read over the advice he gave to his children. I think it really reflects someone who took his responsibilities seriously. So what goes wrong in Kiev? As I mentioned before, after the death of Vladimir Monomach, there was a great deal of internal struggle for power and influence. At the same time, the Mediterranean was gaining in prominence as a trading center, so Kiev's position became less important. And perhaps most importantly, this weakened state became fodder for an invading force from the east, a group of people known as the Mongols, or the Tatars, who came from Central Asia. The most famous of these was Genghis Khan, and it was his grandson, Batu Khan, who led the invasion force that decisively subjugated Kievan Rus. Almost every town was sacked, except for some in the north, such as Novgorod, and this allows for the transfer eventually of Russian culture to more northern towns, and the emergence of a new capital to take the place of Kiev. Stay tuned for that. The Mongol domination lasted about 200 years, until Ivan the Terrible was able to convincingly drive them out. It's important to note, however, that the Mongols had never really ruled as occupiers. They operated on the basis of terror, riding through in massive numbers, burning towns to the ground, capturing people and selling them as slaves, and then just exacting exorbitant sums of money from the remaining towns and survivors. They even continued these raids periodically well after Ivan the Terrible, but by that point many Russian cities had developed their own security enough to prevent the Mongols from gaining the upper hand again. Here are the primary lasting effects of the Mongol domination for you to read over and study. This period serves as the foundation point for many key aspects of Russian culture that we will continue to discuss over the course of the semester. So we sum up with the legacy of Kiev going forward, which can be found in social institutions, political institutions, and religion. I want to call your attention to a term that appears a couple of times here, boyar. The boyars were the nobility, essentially the level of society that had money and land, but were not members of the princely families or royalty. They continued to be a sort of thorn in the side of the Tsars and royal families for the next couple of centuries. Their Boyar Duma, listed among the political institutions, will also periodically crop up again as a rudimentary form of representative government, and something that the Tsar occasionally throws their way as a bone to keep them out of his hair. You should take away from this presentation the fact that society was stratified in Kiev and Rus, a powerful autocrat was an accepted form of leadership, and orthodoxy provided a strong cultural base for society to grow on.